Hello! You're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and today we have the first in the 2024 Saskatchewan election forecast, which should be sometime for October, though it could be a little earlier depending. I've heard some rumors, but usually these rumors are complete noise, so expect 2020 or October-ish. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to shout out to all of my channel members who really help make everything easier, smooth over things, make things more predictable. If you want to help the channel out, you should by all means go down below and join as a member. If you can't afford that, I understand, and by all means just do your regular YouTube things then, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. Well, no further ado, let us begin. So, I will just put a caveat on this forecast. There's two caveats first before I get into the rest of the video. The first is similar to BC, the demographic data by riding is less than ideal. It's not as much, it's not the same standard as federal or some of the other provinces. But that's not the end of the world. I mean, I've done it before successfully with this level of data, so that's not a red flag by itself. The bigger one that I want to really caution right now is there's just not a lot of polls. We've only really had 6 polls in the last year-ish. That's not a lot. Especially because a lot has happened in the last year. A lot happens every year in politics. So we're off loose data. And I really only made this forecast and this model now, in particular, is I think a lot of people are over-interpreting the last poll that came out. But we'll get into that more momentarily. So let's just do an overview here, just on the mechanics of the Saskatchewan model, because there's some things that are worth just mentioning here. So here we have the 6 parties I'm modeling here. So we got the Saskatchewan Party, the NDP, the Greens, the PCs, Buffalo Party, and other. The reason why I have picked these 4 parties is these 5 parties and other is because individually these 5 parties did reasonably well for all things considered in 2020. So I have a good understanding of where they're strong, what their voter base looks like. And there is some polling with them. Now there's a new party, for those familiar from Saskatchewan might be aware of this, people watching from afar, the Saskatchewan United Party. Nadine Wilson resigned from the caucus because she lied about her COVID vaccine status, and subsequently has now formed her own party, or joined a party. Not 100% sure on the details there, it's not that relevant, called the Saskatchewan United Party. There's only been 2 polls that have had Saskatchewan United Party in them, but they're back from April and June of last year, and they're from not one of the better pollsters. A local Saskatchewan pollster, Insightrix, but Insightrix is a record. Not terrible, but not one of the average tier of Canada. They're not one of the top pollsters. So it's kind of hard to try to model that when there's no data. I don't know what their support looks like. I don't know where it is. So they're in other, like I am considering them. They're just not their own party because I don't have the fidelity to actually model them distinctly from other. I just don't have enough data for it. But with that, let us touch on the main topic of today. So those of you watching this are probably familiar with another person who does the same thing I'm doing without the long form videos, 338 Canada. Now, I have nothing against Philip Fournier and 338 Canada. I think for the most part he does quite a good job. The website's nice, good, nothing wrong with it. However, I do have a point to pick with Saskatchewan. His Saskatchewan forecast is 46 to 45, with 3 for Saskatchewan Party, or Saskatchewan United Party, with 33 to 28 in seats. Now, this is a February 9th forecast, so it's a bit old now. Mine's a February 26th forecast. But even back at February 9th, I think he is out to lunch. That is an absurd forecast. The reason why it's an absurd forecast is that poll is not a good poll. And this isn't that it's not a good poll because Insightrix is a bad company. It's a bad poll because it doesn't actually make sense. I'll show you what I mean. So here we have the 2020 results by region. The headlines are slightly different because I'm forecasting obviously different turnout numbers, and I'm using the same turnout forecast as I have for this. But anyways, these numbers are correct for my definition of the regions. Notice that in the north and the south, the rural areas, and I will just put this over here so we can see what I mean. Roughly speaking, this is the north, and roughly speaking, this is the south. We're not going for Olympic level fidelity here. It's just good enough. This is actually what the regions are defined to anyways. So like I'm not inventing the regions, but anyways. In the north, we have plus 54, or sorry, the south is plus 54 Saskatchewan Party. The north is plus 40. In Saskatoon, we are looking at plus 10 for the Saskatchewan Party. In Regina, we're looking at plus 1.4. So let's look at this most recent Insightrix poll. Just make it a little smaller so we can easily compare this. Sorry, I'm really struggling here. Okay, here we go. So, headline 49 to 47, and that's what a lot of people are overfitting on, including 338. He's not wrong math-wise. He's just wrong in some of the assumption his model makes. So, the reason why, so look at this. In Saskatoon, we're at 66 to 32, which is a big change. Sure, whatever. But then, if you compare this to the last Insightrix poll in October, let me just bring it up here. Here we go. You'll notice here that 65 to 31 in Saskatoon. So Saskatoon effectively is unchanged between these two polls, and this poll is 51 to 45, which is a comfortable, uncontroversial SKP majority. You look at Regina, we're at 44 or 53 to 44 for the NDP. You look back in October, 59 to 37. So actually the SKP has regained ground in Regina. And at this point, if you look at the 2021 or 2020 performance, the SKP is not wildly off their 2020 performance. They're pretty much in the same margin of error. The NDP has gained ground, which is uncontroversial. They have gained ground for sure. The SKP has lost ground for sure. I'm not contradicting that. But this poll itself, the scale is wild. So the big one that's worth looking here, and this is the part that makes it immediately a red flag to anyone who should be looking at this. You look at the October Insightrix poll. This is already really big changes in the South, which is almost stretches credibility itself. But it has 28 to 66 for the NDP. So they gained 10 points, and the SKP has lost 6, 14-point swing. That's already a really big swing. Not impossible. It's perfectly within the realm of plausibility. But it's a big swing. The most recent Insightrix poll here, as I have here, has it 37 to 59. That's absurd. The NDP have gained 19 points. SKP has lost 13 for a 32-point swing. That rarely ever happens. And then you combine this with the fact that they're actually regaining ground in urban Saskatchewan. That stretches credibility a lot. Considering the 14-point was already substantial. Then you're looking at another 18-point swings in just 4 months. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen on the federal level. That doesn't happen on the provincial level. You don't see such big swings in a region like that federally, or that fast, I should say. Federally, to get an example, right now we're looking in Atlantic Canada around 45 conservative to 30 liberal, which is about a 28-point swing from 2021. And about half that swing has been since June of last year, so about 7 months. But a lot of big things have happened to specifically alienate Atlantic Canada. We have the carbon tax, we have the housing crisis getting really bad, stuff like that. Things that have clearly and affirmatively happened to alienate this one region in particular to cause such a big swing. And then the Poilievre campaign and the CPC have done a lot of things to court the region in particular. You look at southern rural Saskatchewan, there isn't such big events. The only major event going on in Saskatchewan right now is a big teacher strike, and there's some discontent with Mo because the economy's weak, and some people want him to are discontent with, from both sides of the aisle, on his social policies. Some think he's too soft, some think he's too slow, some think he's too harsh, etc. But nothing that should actually alienate southern rural Saskatchewan to such a degree in 4 months. An 18-point swing in 4 months is insane. That just doesn't happen. Like anywhere. And then to make this worse, we have the north. In the north, according to this poll, the October poll down here, we have 34 to 63, which is a reasonable change. So we're talking about, about a 10-point swing. That makes sense, sure. From October to February, we're talking about going from plus 29 margin to plus 16. So another 13-point swing. What? And at the same time, again, they're rebounding in the urban areas. So they're losing the rurals in double-digit swings, poll over poll, in 4 months. No. This isn't happening. This poll's clearly been poorly sampled. And what usually happens, and we shouldn't be surprised either, I should just add here, because rural areas are wildly missampled all the time. What makes Janet Brown in Alberta a good Alberta pollster isn't that she's good at Calgary, isn't that she's good at Edmonton, is that she gets the rurals correct. And getting the rurals this wrong, because this is wrong. This is objectively wrong. This is not going to happen. I will bet somebody, I don't know, $100 this won't happen. It will not be anywhere close to these numbers. And why is that? Well, pollsters systemically in Canada screw up rural areas. They don't estimate them well at all. You see this quite normally in Alberta. It's a very clear-cut case. I will just bring up some polls for you, just so I can illustrate what I mean. So this was the Alberta 2023 election. campaign period polls. We get 52, 53 to 44 as the final result. And look at some of these polls. We have 1 point lead, 2 point lead, 4 point lead, 5 point lead, 1 point lead, 6 point lead. And why are all these polls not great? It's because they got the rurals wrong. And again, note down here, we have Janet Brown, her last poll, 8 point lead for the UCP. The end result is 8.6. Difference easily explainable by rounding errors. And that's, again, it's the rules. And just to show you this, here is my post-mortem numbers. So this was the final result for the Alberta rurals. A 40-point lead, well, actually 41-point lead for the UCP. The bagel polling raw here is just what the raw polls were saying. The raw polls, before I do any of my weighting, any of my fancy math stuff that I'm not really going to fully disclose here because it's trade secret, we're at a 23-point lead. So that means it's 18 percentage points off. And it's not because they're wrong with the small right-wing parties. It's not because they're wrong with the Alberta Party. It's not because they're wrong with the Alberta Liberals or the other parties. Well, there's a bit off. No. This is wrong because it's overestimating the NDP and, well, wildly overestimating the NDP and slightly less underestimating the UCP. And just to further illustrate this, here are what the raw polls look like for May 27th. So, our target number here, I'll just close this banner. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. What the heck? 1 second. So, okay, here we are. Our target number is 68 to 37. Some of these polls are okay. Some of these are not. This ledger poll's 24 points. This one's 25. This one's 24. Some of these are decent, like this Research Co poll, 40-point margin. Good job, Research Co. I could keep going on. Some of this Abacus poll, like 48%. I mean, there's others here, or undecideds, but still, like, some of these are quite bad. And that's what's happening here. Or that's what I'm contending is happening here. This poll is off because it's underestimating the rurals quite substantially. And anyone who is fitting their model to this poll, first off, if your model's fitting to this poll naturally, just by putting this one poll in, it's causing it to be a close race, your model's far too sensitive and it's overfitting to the recent results. Your model isn't very good. I'm sorry, it's not very good. Now, in the case of someone like 338, his overall model works fine because you just get so many polls. But in a race like this, where there's not a lot of polls, overfitting to the most recent poll is a really bad idea. Again, we've had 5 polls in 2023-2024. 5. If you were overfitting to the closest poll, what's happening is you are saying that the race, you are weighting that one data point too much. Overfitting to the most recent poll when you're talking about 5 polls per month federally? Sure, whatever. It's not a big deal. I don't like it, but it's a fine whatever. You're talking about 1 poll every few months? Then your model's going to say, this is a really, really close race because of an outlier. It's not a close race. It's absurd to even say this is a close race. The people are only saying it because of one singular poll. One. And I'll note, again, I haven't run the numbers on this, but I'm actually pretty sure this is a UCP or SKP win. if you follow me on Twitter, you'll get the update later this week. I'm going to run the numbers. I just don't have time as of recording this to do it. But the point stands. This is probably not even a slam dunk NDP majority. Because let's just war game this out, okay? So my model, we're talking about what, a 18 point swing in Saskatoon. So let's say they pick up 4 seats in Saskatoon. Great, okay. They lose some ground in Regina. Okay, so let's say they lose 4 seats in Regina. So they've lost 8 seats now. Saskatchewan Party. Where does it put us? 35 to 25. Or 36 to 25. Oh, well, great. Rurals? 2. It's just 2. This one and this one. Maybe North Moose Jaw if we're really pushing it. So 3? Let's say 3. We're at 33 to 28 with this poll. With 49 to 47. SKP's still winning. And this is a terrible poll for them. And again, it's not just Alberta. It's not just Saskatchewan. This happens everywhere. The case of the rurals being missed. Sometimes that's fine because the rurals don't often vote very high in other countries. In Canada, actually, rural turnout is really good. Our rural voters are very engaged in the electoral process. And they usually skew anti-left. They're not necessarily conservatives, but they're not social democrats anymore. They're not socialists anymore. Back in the day in Saskatchewan, that probably was true, especially in more mining areas. But these days, rural voters are either very libertarian-ish or very socially conservative. There's not many other people who live in rurals anymore. Most other people have moved to cities by now. So the people living in the rurals are usually those two categories. Or you kind of have a third group. This group actually is the one who probably doesn't vote very often, which is what you would call the right-wing populist base. So usually unionized, usually working class, usually lower income. People who would have been in manufacturing or similar jobs in small towns, but have lost their job because of outsourcing. That kind of person. They usually don't vote very much, but when they do, they tend to vote for right-wing populist parties, or occasionally, or not occasionally, or if there's a appropriate, they might vote for a classic NDP party. These are kind of people who would be a Jack Layton, Maxime Bernier swing voter. Like this kind of guy. But overall, we see this trend in Saskatchewan. We see this trend in Alberta. We see this trend in BC. We see this trend in Manitoba. We see this trend in Ontario. We see this trend in Atlantic Canada. A little bit in Quebec, not as much. Where the rural vote is missed. And part of that, I think these days, is actually how online polls are done. Online polling, it's not random, it's not probabilistic. It's usually pretty good, but there is a bias in it. Only people who sign up for polls get online polls. And you have to actually know that that company exists first, and then second, you have to be willing to do surveys for them. And then you have to actually fill out the survey. I'm in some online panels, and I don't even fill out all the surveys all the time. Because it's a hassle, I don't have time. And a lot of these rural voters who do vote in substantial quantities are not the kind of people who sit on a computer for leisure to fill out polls. You're talking about like farmers, miners, ranchers, oil workers. A lot of the time, too, in these rural areas, they're older as well, so they're not as, for lack of a better term, tech literate. Though these days a lot of young people are not tech literate either, but that's another story altogether. They're less likely to actually participate in a poll. And I'm not talking about your small towns like your Battlefords or your Moose Jaws. I'm talking about your truly rural areas, like your communities of less than like 3,000 or 4,000 people kind of thing. Like truly small towns, truly rural areas. They don't tend to respond to polls. Online polls, it seems. Because the telephone polls like Janet Brown usually get the rural areas better. Not always, but usually. And it kind of has to be live color telephone too. IVR doesn't seem to get it quite right. I'm not exactly sure, but usually something like Main Street is usually better than Leisure, for example, at rurals. Not always, but usually. And it just seems to be this skew in every single region. This seems to happen. You'll notice, as another example, let us look at the 2021 Canadian election. Specifically in Atlantic Canada. So if you look at the actual results, and then you look at, say, the polling result. So we look at these polls for 2021 here, courtesy of Polling Canada, or CanadianPolling.ca, I should say. And you'll notice here, wait, sorry, these are the wrong numbers. Okay, I don't actually have the Atlantic numbers broken down nice in a nice format here for the 2021 election, but these are the polls just afterwards, so these close enough. You get the idea. There's a slight bias after elections, an incumbent gains some ground, but that's neither here nor there. Again, the thing you see here, compared to the actual numbers, this is me, by the way. This is Bagel polling. Boop. I was very close here. Actually, I was the closest. Why am I the closest? It's not because I had better polls than everyone else. I had the same polls. No, it's because my model does some assumptions and some modeling that better captures biases in polls. One of these biases is how rurals vote differently. And in Atlantic Canada, that is a big deal. Rural response rate is quite low. You'll notice here, some of these polls for, say, Greens and NDP combined, quite substantial. No, it wasn't. Liberals usually perform roughly about where they perform. And it's the Conservatives usually overperform. I slightly overestimated here for unrelated reasons, which if you ever watch previous content, I went into this. So this isn't a perfect forecast. This is an older version. Wow. Could you believe it? My model from 2021 is older than the one I use now. Anyways. The point here is the raw polling underestimated the Conservatives and overestimated the NDP in Nova Scotia in Atlantic Canada and the Greens too. And again, because rural response rate is funky. So what ends up seeming to happen, I can't say this for certain, I'm not done the proper research, but what seems to happen is the response rate for large towns like Moose Jaw, Prince Albert, your Yorktons, your Battlefords, whatever, dominate the actual responses for the rurals. So it's not rurals per se, it's actually the large towns in the rurals responding. So what you see on the Alberta level and why the Alberta polling in the rurals was likely so bad was it was dominated by Lethbridge and Red Deer. If you look at Lethbridge and Red Deer, that's actually pretty close to what the polls were saying. The polling average was saying, I should say. But that ignores the small towns, the hamlets, the farmsteads that actually make up a large percentage of rural inhabitants. If you look at, say, Nova Scotia, where I'm from, rural areas are mostly 500, 1,000, 2,000 person towns. In rural Nova Scotia, there's only a handful of even large towns. We have Truro, there's Bridgewater, there's New Glasgow, Stellage, and Pictou. Sydney's an actually pretty substantial area, especially if you add Glace Bay, New Waterford, because it's kind of the same urban area. You could say Wolfville area, all the surrounding towns, sure. I've named you 5 urban areas there. It's probably better part of let's say 200,000 people. That means there's, of rural Nova Scotia, which is about 600,000 people, there's 400,000 people living in towns that are smaller than about 10,000. Or urban areas that are smaller than about 10,000. Think about that for a second. And it's even more true in places like Saskatchewan. Because the specific geography of something like Nova Scotia actually encourages settlement formation. Because fishing communities need a community. You can't have a fishing farmstead. Whereas you can and will have farmsteads. That's why farmstead is a word. And we have them in Nova Scotia too, don't get me wrong. But a lot of the rural population is in fisheries in Nova Scotia. Whereas in Saskatchewan, surprisingly, possibly, there's not a lot of fishermen. So the rural populations are now dominated instead by farmsteads, because farming is actually quite large in Saskatchewan. Now, in Saskatchewan, you also have things like mining and oil and gas and stuff like that, which also encourages community formation. But that's also true in Nova Scotia, or true in New Brunswick. New Brunswick is another good example. The polls in New Brunswick usually overestimate Liberal support because they underestimate responses for rurals, for the Conservatives. They have huge swings in rural areas for the Conservatives because they miss a lot of the voters. And why this is a big deal, but it's not a big deal in something like a city. The difference between someone living, say, Moose Jaw, and someone's living in rural Lloydminster is very different. Your guy who's living in a town of about 2,000 people built around, I don't know, coal mine. Everyone in the town works in that coal mine. That kind of stuff. Or this town is some oil wells. We work on these oil wells. That kind of stuff. Which is less these days for sure, but or like the factory town, like that kind of stuff. Those voters are very different to the more towny voters. They vote differently. Your farmsteader, your farmer living on 1,000 acres of farmland, is quantifiably distinct to your townie in Moose Jaw. They're a different kind of person. They have different demographic criteria. They live in a different community, very different. They probably work a completely different thing. Odds are, a lot of people working in Moose Jaw, I won't say Moose Jaw, but because I don't know actually about the specifics of Moose Jaw, but a lot of people living in the larger towns, in the rurals, a lot higher are in service industries or in secondary industries like healthcare or education or nursing. Nursing, I guess, is healthcare. Those tend to conglomerate in the towns, the large towns, whereas the smaller satellite communities are different. I'll just use myself, for example. I recently bought a house in a small town. I won't disclose where it is, but that small town forms a bunch of is part of a bunch of small little satellite communities that all pre-exist modern day, sure, but they all surround the outskirts of a larger town. So a lot of services that I would want to use I go to the larger town too, which is not far away. We're only talking 10, 15-minute drive, which in the suburbs is normal. So this is not a very far distance away by road, but it's a different community. It's a different place. And because of that, these large towns conglomerate more people. And since the differential response rate puts these rurals very different, the deep rurals different than the town rurals, but we mostly get town rurals responding unless you do a really good job searching for it or trying to get them responses. You get these skews, and these skews are just kind of baked in the data because the deep rurals are very different voters than the townies. And the townies and the deep rurals are very different than urbanites. The city folk, they're different voters. And that's why you don't actually need that many voters polled in Saskatoon to be decent at Saskatoon polling. Most people living in a city are more similar to each other than the 100,000 or 200,000. Sorry, it's like 300,000, I think. Let's go with 300,000. 300,000 people living in Saskatoon are more similar to each other than the 300,000 people living in rural Saskatchewan. Demographically. The difference between the Moose Jaws, Prince Alberts, Yorkton, and deep rural Saskatchewan is very different. I mean, you can see this right here. Moose Jaw is actually fairly competitive. We're talking about a 5 to 10 margin and a 10 to 20 margin. So it's fairly competitive. The entire ridings around it are like 50 plus margins. Or sorry, 40 plus margins. Some close to 50 plus. This very clearly qualitatively different voters. North Moose Jaw is like 30 points less conservative than the surrounding deep rural. And Moose Jaw is a small town. I think it's like 40,000 people or something like that. Like, it's not a big town. Or is it 30,000? Whatever. You correct me wrong in the comments. But the point is, it's not a very big town. But the difference between Moose Jaw and the deep rurals is huge. And then even Moose Jaw to Yorkton. Or let's say Moose Jaw to Swift River because they're similar area. That's also a huge difference. Swift Current is like 25 points voting to the right of Moose Jaw. North, I should say. Like, it's a big difference. And that's why we're getting people like 338, who's usually pretty good, but in this case, or other modelers or other people you see, they're overfitting to one poll that is clearly wrong, and it's wrong in a very predictable and obvious way. And the reason why people are getting this wrong is not because they're bad at what they're doing. They're getting this wrong because they are naively plugging in the numbers. They're taking the poll at face value. And for the record, I entered this poll as is. As is. This poll is in my model. No changes. Headlines, regionals, all thing. But because my model actually tries to model people how they vote, and not just plug in what the polls say as verbatim, we get a big difference. Because the polls tell us, even this poll tells us that there's movement. People are changing. Different demographics, different types of voters are changing. That's what the poll tells us. But how does that affect and how does it apply to actual identifiable areas? And in aggregate, my model handles that. And explicitly and purposely handles that. And it's handled that out actually since I started it. Most of the stuff I've changed on it since starting this and doing more elections is really just ironing out the fine details. Early on, I was overcorrecting. Now I do less. With that, I'll bid you adieu, and if you let me know below if really going to fine details of how you model things, if this appeals to you. If this doesn't, I won't do this again, because I make videos for people to watch. If you don't want to watch them, why would I make them? Anyways, with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you next week, hopefully.